Dr. P, are they rolling in? Do you see those attendees come in on the right hand side over there? I think we are live. Well, good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening, everybody. I want to wish you all a happy Tuesday. It is the Premier Research Labs May webinar. I'm so excited to be again with you all live for tonight's event. We actually have one of our premier panelists, Dr. Piercy, here, part of our executive team. I'm sure many of you know him from the years in his tenure here at Premier Research Labs. So excited to have him live and excited for you all to be part of our journey into the biodynamic brain, which is the topic of conversation for this evening. This evening we'll be going over different holistic integrative strategies to really nourish neurological health, really trying to open and expand the frontiers of your horizon in terms of how you approach kind of brain topics and brain conversations with your clients and your patients and your practice and your own health is really the name of the game. And so I'm so excited to have you with us here tonight. We are live. So with that live feature, that does mean that we are going to be answering questions at the conclusion of tonight's presentation. So if you think of something, if you just want to say hello, if you have a quantum thought in terms of this conversation, feel free to post it below. We actually have the Q&A question and answer section. You can post those there, and Dr. P and I will essentially be going through that at the conclusion of the webinar. We do have a chat feature as well, so all of that functionality is down below. But Dr. P, before we get started, anything you want to say to introduce yourself to the attendees tonight?
Hello, everybody. Dr. Gary Piercy here, retired chiropractor. Will is really going to take you out there and try to expand your mind on this. I'm here to remind you that you do work in a clinic, and there are specific things that come up in situations like this that some of these products would be very useful for. So we're going to try to offer you both sides of that coin tonight.
I work a little bit more of the philosophical, kind of the big world kind of thoughts and conversations. And so expanding your frontier there, but I'm trying to ground down into real world clinical applications. So we should have some fun. For those who do not know who I am, I'm actually the sales manager here at Premier Research Labs. I work with Dr. P in terms of clinical strategies and different product promotions, and I've been an executive myself. So it really is my pleasure to be delivering this information to you all this evening and helping just support your practice in the multitude of different ways that we do here at Premier Research Labs. As with all of these webinars, we do have a little bit of a disclaimer for those that are an attendee. So let me get through that real quick, and then we'll dive straight into the details here. So this information that is going to be presented this evening is for the use of physicians and other licensed healthcare practitioners only. You think after doing this for so long, I get this down.
Take a breath.
Right, exactly. This information is intended for physicians and other licensed healthcare providers to use as a basis for determining whether or not to recommend these products to their patients. The medical and scientific information is not for use by consumers. The dietary supplement products offered by Premier Research Labs are not intended for use by consumers as a means to cure, treat, prevent, diagnose, or mitigate any disease or other medical condition. Talk about the mouthful there.
Good job. All right.
Thank you. So let me pull up my slides here so we can get started. All right, here. And so tonight's topic of conversation is the biodynamic brain. Really what I'm looking to accomplish here is kind of the rationale and the thought of how we should approach neurological health with our patients, kind of the different strategies that may be relevant in practice, really kind of going from an ingredient basis. For those that aren't familiar with Premier Research Labs, we are a dietary supplement manufacturer. We offer over 140 different products to our line. And so there's a lot of complementary and integrative therapies that go along with these strategies. Of course, we're trying to be very concise in terms of what's most relevant for brain health. So just know that there's a whole multitude of different topics that we ultimately could cover in this section. My goal is to try to be the most piercing and most effective with what we've seen in terms of clinical relevance. So know that we would love to touch on everything that goes into brain health. Sadly, for tonight's presentation, we will kind of have to truncate that. So tonight's webinar is brought to you by and sponsored by Premier Research Labs. And we, if you are with us have been with us for many years, or this is your first time attending, we actually do have a webinar special. So we'll be bringing that back at the conclusion of tonight's webinar. Essentially, our webinar special is going to be kind of our plethora, or our Fab 3 or Fab 4, I guess, because it is 4 products technically, of Premier Research Labs brain health products. First being our Cognotropic, essentially our advanced brain factor dietary supplement support product, which actually does have products or ingredients that have been clinically studied to support brain health, including Numintix and a neurofactor, essentially helping to support and raise levels of BDNF and actually potential new neurogenesis in the brain with the Numintix. So if you haven't given that a try, it's a great opportunity to stock up for you and your patients. We do have a buy 6 or more, get 15% off promotion for that item. The following 2 items that go along with that to kind of build into the brain health protocol is essentially our EPA DHA marine liquid and our soft gel. That is going to be an anchovy and sardine based fish oil product that does give you a clinical dose of EPA and DHA. It is in the whole triglyceride form. So we'll actually kind of go into the rationale in terms of why we prefer that whole triglyceride oil, non-molecularly distilled. That is the natural way of supplementation in terms of dietary or omega-3 supplementation. So if you're looking to stock up on that this week or really tomorrow, that is a buy 6 or more and get 15% off. And then our final product as part of our brain health program here is going to be the Premier Multivitamin. Essentially, when you look at brain health, right, we really are wanting to have a multitude of different micronutrients that includes the vitamin B6, B12, folate, right, to make sure that we have optimal methylation, but also that micronutrient density. When we look at brain health, it really is trying to nourish the brain environment so that we have a plethora of kind of, I guess, different inputs to optimize the overall function of the brain. So, when we look at a brain health protocol, making sure that your micronutrient density, especially for that client, is going to be very relevant. So that is going to be a buy 6 or more and get 15% off tomorrow only. So feel free to, at the conclusion of tonight's webinar, maybe while you're listening in, if you want to get that order just for tomorrow, slated and ready to go, feel free to email orders@prlabs.com. So that's orders@prlabs.com. And just in the title or the heading of that email, put webinar special, and then whatever contents you would like, as well as your account number, just to make sure that we can process that effectively. Any notes here on that webinar special, Dr. P? Thoughts for the audience?
It looks pretty good. I mean, obviously the omega-3s are going to be essential, brain fats. We'll talk about phospholipids later, but that's another good one. The Cognotropic, of course, gosh, we've gotten such good feedback on that one as far as focus and memory and attention, and I certainly can testify to that. And then, of course, the multivitamin, that's going to be a given. I'm sorry. The way people eat these days, that's just, that's just smart right there, right off the bat. So these look like really good ones that you could easily promote, whether you're talking about brain health or not, honestly.
Yeah, and I think it's very relevant. You want to make, in terms of brain health strategies, there is a lot of different tangential opportunities that you can really explore with the client, and that's really where that personalization comes into play, right? When I look at these 3 products, it is kind of like core factors for brain health, and so that's kind of why we developed that. It's kind of giving you your baseline nutrition to really spur brain health, neurogenesis, and potentially go into longevity factors in the brain as well. So
yeah, and I would think you would see in the crowd that you're familiar with, the people that concerned about building up muscles and all that stuff, they probably notice the effects of a lot of these on their brain. So hopefully 2 for 1 shot there. They're building their muscles and their minds.
Most definitely, I couldn't agree more. So with that being said, if y'all would like to take advantage of that, please feel free to put in those orders this evening. You can email orders@prlabs.com to take advantage of this 1-day promotional offer only. So with that being said, let's dive right into our topic of tonight. It is the biodynamic brain, and really wanted to start off in terms of just kind of centering and grounding us in this thought of what I'm terming quantum cognition. We live in a world that is constantly changing, constantly adapting. Technology is increasing at changing and growing at an astronomical rate. And we, in this day and age, require a brain that is very neuroplastic in terms of its nature. And so when we look at strategies with brain health. Really, the brain health, our brain as an organ gland system, is kind of one of the most undernourished, and a lot of clients aren't even considering brain health when they come into practice or into your practice. They may come for, inflammation, poor digestion, maybe they have a clinical condition that they're trying to, treat and work with you in that regard, but they're not coming into the clinic for brain health. And so why I think brain health is so relevant is, as you work with those integrative strategies with the client, you may be overlooking the key organ gland system that may unlock the door to multiple different health systems as well. When we talk about stress, when we talk about anxiety, when we talk about the overall emotional body, right? That is a key. The relevance there is very key into the brain health system as a whole. We as a society, when we look at our neurocognition in terms of cognitive capacity, we're very grounded in logic in terms of how we approach our days, right? We have to have very firm neural connections. And so with that firm neural connection, it does lock in a certain form of patterning with the brain. And that patterning it's very beneficial, right? If you're trying to regurgitate information like on this webinar, or maybe you have to do a math problem, right? Or a dosing strategy, right? It's a very locked in pattern. But when we look at what I'm terming and when we seek that universal mind, we have to be able to look beyond the patterns. It's just like when you see a clinic or a client for the first time, you actually want to assess the patterns that they may be demonstrating in terms of their patient, their physiology, right? But then you want to be able to connect the dots. And that's where, that mastery in terms of you as a clinician really comes into play, is that ability to really see beyond the patterns that client is demonstrating. And so we really, whenever we as practitioners or clinicians are wanting to consult and interface with the client, we want to have that level of quantum cognition that really allows us to see beyond what that patient may be coming in with, right? So then you can actually make more pertinent real world strategies that are really, diverse and different than the normal, client or practitioner, would be able to prescribe. And so that's what makes you a master of your craft, right? Is having that level of quantum cognition. But we want our clients to have the same, right? They are in the same work environment. They are in the same world that we live in. And we as human beings are very, we're almost evolutionary predisposed to that pattern recognition. But where we have our level of mastery in terms of our crafts is being able to see beyond that. And so when we look at quantum cognition and when we look at the biodynamic brain, is kind of what I'm terming, is we're trying to achieve that level of, neural fluidity or neural health that really allows the body to relax and open up to seeing those different patterns and those different opportunities, right? But if you have an undernourished brain, if you have a brain that is basically not adapted to stress, right? Because we do live in a society where there's a plethora of food, and we're a stress averse, society as a whole. We are not necessarily stimulating these neural pathways that do allow for that recognition and expansion beyond those certain learned conditions. So just in terms of kind of what quantum cognition means to me and that universal mind, kind of giving you a little bit of background. Dr. P, does that resonate with you, or any thoughts in terms of?
Oh, absolutely. And, from the other side of the coin, if you can't meditate while you're at work, you can certainly learn some of those patterns that he was talking about and use them to your advantage. In other words, if you see a certain combination of behaviors, symptoms, deficiencies, readings on your machine, after a while, you'll begin to recognize that even though maybe they're not complaining about being depressed or overstressed or having trouble sleeping or hormone imbalance or whatever, this leads to, you might actually pick up on the signs of it before it becomes symptomatic, and can then address it even at the level of, you should probably eat more fish, or get some more DHA in your diet, or get some exercise, take a break. It's not the end of the world. I mean, there's a million ways you can approach it if you get it soon enough. And that's the idea for me of that quantum approach, not waiting till it's symptomatic, but actually picking up on what we would call the field of that person and noticing that something is off.
Yeah. And that really segues into this concept of the neural network. And so that is where we are really looking to build strategies as clinicians, right, to promote that neuroplasticity. We live in a neuroplastic environment, right? The world is ever adapting, ever changing. We want to aim that our strategies with patients are of a neuroplastic nature. And so you really want to create not only a stimulus environment for that individual where that neuroplasticity is fostered. That's where, learning a new language, traveling, learning an instrument, dabbling in art, creative endeavors, reading, right? That is creating a neuroplastic environment around you, right, externally. But we also want to have that internal environment that is very neuroplastic in that sense. And so this is where, hormetic stressors, looking at factors of hormesis, trying to stimulate the brain and the body in ways that are very adaptive in nature, right? Cause the body to go through a beneficial stress response are actually beneficial, because what you're enabling the body to do is to form new neural connections or to strengthen pathways that ultimately allow for clearance of different neural debris or cellular debris, right? That makes that environment of the brain much more fluid. And so when we talk about leveraging longevity pathways for long-term health of the brain, that really is going into account of these different, starvation factors, or, when you look at these different cellular pathways that get stimulated from a quote unquote stressful environment, we're essentially able to leverage that to expand the fitness of the brain itself, right? And so, those pathways do include mTOR, they include AMPK pathways, and that includes the stimulation of sirtuin. So those are kind of the main longevity pathways that we like to work with. And a lot of times when we're working with nutrition, right, herbals and botanicals, we're actually helping to promote activity within these pathways, right? Or down regulate those pathways so that we're able to actually kind of stimulate a level of hormesis that is beneficial to the body. And that's, that down regulation specifically applies more so to mTOR. And I know we'll get into that conversation as we go into dietary restriction models and time restricted eating windows. Dr. B, any thoughts?
Yeah, and the whole thing is about inflammation and its negative effects on the body. So anything we can do to reduce that, whether it's dietary modification or whether it's supplementation or whether it's meditation, there's a lot of Asians we can throw at it. It's kind of, what is the focus of your clinic? What is it that you're offering them that they're not hearing from their MD, and the MDs out there, I apologize for making an assumption because you're here. But for the most part, the medical profession doesn't address these things in the way that our practitioners do, directly and effectively, whether it's with nutrition or some of the other, suggestions that we'll have coming up here. There are many ways to affect the network, if you will, because what is the body but a network of networks?
Just an all interconnected networks on a network relaying information about the network, right? So
exactly.
That 5 times fast. And so this kind of gets into the kind of almost the philosophical, distillation of what a good diet in terms of neurological health. And this is what, kind of the 4 main key points to hit on whenever you're looking and creating a diet or a program for an individual that is looking to foster that neuroplastic environment. And so I'm going to term this the quote unquote mind diet in terms of what we would be looking for in terms of supporting that individual. And so these principles include omnipotent omegas. So that includes a rich, biodiverse kind of plethora of different omega-3 fatty acids, or really just the 2 omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. That is to help to support overall structural integrity and synaptic fluidity within the brain, to really create an environment where it is able to adapt very proficiently, right? We'll actually go into the conversation of omegas here shortly. I'm also going to say that you're looking for a multiverse of micronutrients for cognitive health. So that is looking at a bunch of different stimulating and enriching factors from a multitude of different foods. If y'all were attended my kind of webinar on gut health, right? It's really looking in terms of gut health strategies, having a very rich, biodiverse, different food sources, right? Because that's ultimately going to stimulate a very healthy microecology within the gut, Well, that same kind of philosophy in terms of micronutrient density does apply to the brain as well. And so when you have a rich, very diverse diet, you're going to get a lot of different xenohormetic molecules or micronutrients that ultimately could translate into brain health or nourish different organ gland systems that then of course translate into brain health as well. When we talk about that neural network, it's so important that we're not just focusing on factors for the brain. We want to go into the liver, we want to go into the cardiovascular system, we want to go into the adrenals, and so on and so forth, and optimize digestion as well. There's a whole topic in terms of the brain gut axis that we could dive down into tonight. But to kind of simplify it in regards to neurological health, it is that multiverse of micronutrients just to make sure that we are stimulating different pathways in regards to neurological health and synaptic fluidity, as well as structural integrity. The next would be kind of the key factor in regards to neural pH, are just making sure that we as clinicians are balancing, are looking at the pH balance of the client that's coming into the office. That kind of distills down to, if you're not familiar with our kind of philosophies here at Premier Research Labs, is making sure that they're getting appropriate mineral supplementation or minerals in their diet. That is very crucial for buffering capacity. That also goes into the overall energy levels of the body as a whole. But of course, we know probably as clinicians that the efficacy of the nerves, right, to actually have neural transmission is dependent on the sodium-gated ion channels in regards to just the depolarization, the repolarization of those neuronal fibers. And so making sure that you have optimal mineral concentrations where they need to be, right, is basically 101 to make sure that you have proper neurological health and you're actually able to think, fire, execute, and act appropriately once you do have those quantum thoughts, right? And then kind of the last and final point would be biodiverse hormetic stressors, right? So looking at different lifestyle factors, lifestyle augmentations, right, that ultimately create a system or cultivate a system of what is anti-fragility, which essentially means that the body is able to handle stress very well, right? We as a, if you look at the society as a whole, we're a very stress-averse society. And so you want to encourage lifestyle augmentations. That could be time restricted eating. That could be looking at different cold or hot heat exposure, right? Exercise as another one. Really tough mental challenges or puzzles, right? That ultimately encourage the body to be more adaptive in terms of those neural networks. So kind of going into our first topic of conversation here, it would be the omega-3 conversation, kind of omnipotent omegas. And really what we're looking for is when we are looking to have a very neuroplastic environment, we're wanting to really create a quantum state of neural fluidity, right? And that comes from the dosing and the usage of omega-3s. There's a plethora of different studies in regards to how omega-3s can really benefit the body as a whole. When we look at omega-3s, it really is the conversation around structural integrity and the synaptic fluidity, right? Those omega-3 fatty acids are going directly into the cell membranes, right, of the nerve cells, right? And they will go into the myelin sheath, right, of the nerves themselves. And so to make sure that we have the appropriate responsiveness within the brain, there's a very key factor in terms of that EPA and DHA concentration that is going into going into the cell membrane. This of course goes into overall health, right? Omega-3s, take the bucket in terms of cardiovascular health. They go into not just cardiovascular, but adrenal, hormonal, right? Hormonal pathways in terms of fat, and so on and so forth. And so really when I look at dosing strategy with omega-3s, we'd be trying to accomplish, if we're really going for a more clinical dosing strategy for neuronal health, is about 2 to 3 grams of non-molecularly distilled fish oil or 1 to 2 grams of plant-based DHA. And that would be a per day strategy. This is where we get into kind of a conversation of the type of DHA or EPA supplementation does matter. There's a lot of products that are on the market that are essentially molecularly distilled. There's the loss of that triglyceride backbone, or they've been synthetically upregulated to increase the amount of fatty acids in the overall supplement. And so with that upregulation, you're actually getting a more synthetic form of those EPA and DHA molecules, and you're actually circumventing the natural pathways of digestion and absorption of those omega-3s. And so what's actually been shown in clinical studies is that when you actually have the DHA in the natural triglyceride form, you actually get a absorption or an increase in that bioavailability by at least 2 to 3 times fold in terms of that ability for the body to integrate that. Now, keep in mind, when we are supplementing with those triglyceride forms, the concentration is going to be less, right? Because you have the fat macromolecule, and then you're actually going to have the omega-3 fatty acids as part of that triglyceride. And so you do need to make sure that you're being very aware of how much omega-3s they're getting with that whole triglyceride form. But the ultimate in dosing strategy should be about 2 to 3 grams of that non-molecularly distilled fish oil in that regards, or plant-based DHA in its full form. Dr. P, thoughts?
Yeah, and hopefully that answers Jeff's question about getting the omega-3s from fish oil. It can be done, and certainly is one of the preferred methods. But as you mentioned, the EFA blend has omega-3, 6, and 9. So that one covers the whole spectrum if you think they're really not getting a good diet. And, again, that's back to where we started, getting the good oils in their diets, asking them, do they eat fish? I mean, simple things like that can get a lot of information that can help you point them in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think when you look at lifestyle factors and kind of analytics of the client themselves, there's going to be factors of inflammation that can upregulate the need in terms of the dosing of the omega-3s, right?
It's not like anybody's under stress. I don't know what you're talking
about. There also could be organ gland systems, right? Like the liver, that's not able to process the fatty acids effectively, right? I mean, you look at a lot of different ways that this dosing may need to be augmented. Also, they could have dispositions of avoidance of fish oils in that regard. But a lot of people, especially on the Western diet, right, we don't get a lot of omega-3s naturally. So we are having to look at supplemental strategies in that regard. When you look at longevity studies as a whole, especially for studies of populations based in Okinawa or Japan, essentially they have a very high omega-3 ratio in the body as a whole. And so we really want to optimize that concentration as much as we can. And of course, sorry?
I said, you're right. The American diet is heavily biased towards the omega-6. And then as soon as you heat up the oils, even if they are good ones, we just don't do it right. I'm sorry.
we don't do it right. And I think, when we look at, that there's this strategy in regards to like how we're cooking with a lot of oils, right? But, I think overall, we want to make sure that we're very much so trying to shift the body to a very high omega-3 ratio. So you do always have to keep in mind that with any fatty acid supplementation or fat supplementation, there may be caloric limits, right? Especially if there's a diet or lifestyle. So I'm not just saying buy a bottle of our EPA DHA fish oil and just chug it. There could be, of course, gallbladder and just digestive concerns in that regards. But when I look at terms of strategies, leaning on the side of being a little bit more heavy-handed is going to ultimately do the body some justice. And this really gets into a really pivotal kind of, almost revolutionary thought in that, those cell membranes of the entire body can either be power transmitters in terms of the photonic bioenergetic kind of resonance of the entire body as a whole, or they can be basically, what would be the analogy, Dr. P? Non-transducers.
They would be producing, if anybody remembers AM radio, they would be making static.
There we go. Yeah. And so we really do want to have that harmonic symphony in terms of how those neural networks and the different cell membranes are coordinating their signaling pathways. And so this is where omega-3s really come into their own in that regard. Kind of tagging along with the thought of omega-3s and omega-3 supplementation would be phosphatidyl complexes. The main really being that phosphatidylserine. When we look at inclusion of phosphatidylserine into the cell membrane, right? Because these complexes, similar to cholesterol, are actually going to be included or embedded into the cell membrane. they actually help to regulate how fluid that membrane is. And so you want that fluidity to help with that adaptability within those neuronal networks. And so there's some really good studies here regarding phosphatidylserine and how that can upregulate different enzyme activation in terms of clearance, especially after like a depolarizing event with the neural networks, right? So you have a nerve fire. You want the body as a whole to reconstitute and readapt so it can fire again, right? There's always that repolarization threshold, right? In terms of allowing that neuronal network to refire. And so you want the body to be able to recover very quickly. And so having complexes or doing dosing strategies with overall complexes that increase that neural fluidity within the nerves or the cell membrane are going to do you benefits in the long term. There's also really good studies in regards to how long-term supplementation with phosphatidyl complexes can actually prevent cognitive decline. And so, you know, when we look at sources of phosphatidyl complexes, you actually can get very rich sources from soy, plant-based, and so like soy lecithin may be a product that you want to integrate. They're synergists, right? So, you know, whenever you integrate that phosphatidyl complex, you know, dosing that with the omega-3 or the fish oil, because that is in whole triglyceride form, that actually does work as a emulsification agent. So that also does help to encourage the digestibility and even the bioavailability of that omega-3 that you're supplementing with. And so we're ultimately trying to bolster the neurotransmission capabilities through that neural fluidity augmentation. And you do have that synaptic, I guess, excitability with those phosphatidyl complexes. Other resonant sources in terms of, you know, phosphatidyl complexes may include white beans and other legumes. And so just really trying to give that biodiverse source, a whole food source even, to the body may be beneficial in that regard. Dr. P?
Well, we don't have legumes. We do have pea protein, so maybe that'll count. But the big star, of course, is the lecithin. You know, that one is super easy. The lecithin granules can literally be sprinkled on your food. Super easy to incorporate in a diet. If they won't take that, give them the Ceravin. I mean, seriously, the phosphatidyl complexes are so important. You know, just get them on something.
Agreed. So kind of getting into the next dietary factor that I look at when we talk about overall neural health would be choline. Really, you know, the analogy that I use here is that it is the parasympathetic key for cognition. Whenever we are wanting to have that creative universal mind, we want the body to be very open. We don't want it to be stressed. We don't want it to be in that sympathetic mode. And so really trying to stimulate the parasympathetic pathways ultimately allow for long-term success. This also goes into vasodilative factors, right? Blood flow, especially to the brain, is very crucial for long-term health. Whenever you have a cardiovascular patient or a client that's coming in for cardiovascular reasons, you know, we want to kind of think how we are encouraging vasodilative functionality within the brain as a whole. Cognitive decline in terms of circulation. So you have cardiovascular dementia, right, as you age. That could be a factor of long-term stress that is ultimately overstimulating the sympathetic nervous system and not allowing that appropriate vasodilative ability because of that overstimulative factor. And so when we look at choline supplementation, we are really looking at trying to stimulate acetylcholine production, which is the primary neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system. Furthermore, choline actually can be, it's a metabolite of trimethylglycine, but it could go into methylation patterns, and we actually have a choline bitartrate, which does serve as a methyl donor in that regard. So just one of those situations where that choline is going to be instrumental in terms of the neurotransmission, right? And the neurotransmitters that go into neurological health. Before I get into that, Dr. P, anything you want to add from a clinical perspective on choline?
Preach, no, just a personal perspective about the cognitive decline due to circulatory issues. I can testify to that. Again, Ceravin. But look at circuzyme as well. You know, look at what is going on. Is it cardiovascular? Is it the actual heart itself? You know, what's going on? There's again several ways we can address that depending on what you determine is going on with this person. So choline is going to be one of the good ones. And for a lot of people, as Will said, that's not something we're really getting in our diet very much anymore.
And whole food strategies can be very limited, right? Especially if you're on like more of a plant-based diet, you may not be
Exactly.
using a lot of choline from the foods in that regard. And so, you know, choline, kind of another tangential conversation point, is really supporting kind of the basal forebrain. And if you look at what happens after supplementation strategies with choline, it actually helps to support activity within kind of the grounding center of the brain. And that basal forebrain is the when you're ever trying to really center in and hone in and dial in your focus and attention, making sure that that area essentially has appropriate activity is ultimately going to translate into long-term success, because when you're learning, when you're grounding into different materials, right, you want to have an ability to reinforce those neural patterns, right, kind of going to the beginning of our conversation. And so when you have a effective way of calming the brain in a, I guess, a stressful or a kind of stress attenuation setting, right, when you're learning, able to have that grounding potential is ultimately going to translate into potentially faster learning, right? Because those patterns are more easily accessible or learned by the neural network. And so this is where, you know, choline supplementation would come into play. I think kind of there's two kind of ways of going about choline supplementation. You can have more of a pulsing strategy, so encouraging essentially a choline pulse, which would be an acute dose of 1 to 2 grams, especially when you're trying to learn something particular, because that pulsing is actually going to reinforce that grounding center within the brain. And so when you're doing that, I guess, learning, when you're in that learning environment and you're trying to learn that new skill, having this augmented dose of choline may actually help to reinforce that patterning or that learning more effectively. And so that would be 1 to 2 grams used, just very dose or time dependent. So for about 1 to 2 weeks is kind of my limitation in regards to that pulsing strategy. Now, for daily support, I typically recommend starting at 50 to 100 milligrams and then moving up to 200 to 500 milligrams. Now, keep in mind with that pulse, it can be, for some people, it's one of those, it could just be a little overstimulating. So you do proceed with caution, especially if you're using like alpha GPC, which is in our Ceravin. It may just, you know, be something that they're grounding too much into. So do proceed with caution, but it is an effective strategy that has been noted in terms of learning and overall kind of neural health. Dr. P?
Hopefully it won't be a problem right now. I think finals are over.
Yeah, exactly. All the grad students and the
college kids and everything. Yeah.
Looking for the healthy Adderall, essentially.
Exactly.
So kind of diving and moving away from the omega-3 cell membrane conversation, moving into the necessity of neural pH. And I think, you know, if you've been with Premier Research Labs for a long time, you know that we're very keen on assessing and looking at the pH of the body, right? That goes into adrenal function, that goes into energy production, right? That goes into cardiovascular health, that goes in really every system of the body is pH dependent, because the overall mechanism for how we produce ATP is pH dependent, right? If you're in a more acidic environment, right, you're actually going to go into a inefficient way of producing ATP from glucose, right? If you're in a very healthy, almost more neutral pH, right, you actually are able to go through that full cellular respiration cycle within the mitochondria and generate the most ATP that you can. And so, you know, when we talk about nerve health and we talk about brain health, we can't really skip over pH in that regard. And so, you know, really when we talk about pH, it is you could distill that into the different organ gland systems and the whole body physiological systems in terms of the health. But I'm going to center more so into the voltage gated sodium channels in regards to how the efficacy and the effectiveness of those channels are. If you don't have proper pH balance, you essentially are looking at a promotion of neurological disease within the brain itself. And so looking at mineral supplementation, calcium, magnesium, even sodium, getting a biodynamic salt like the Premier Pink salt, to make sure that you are getting enough sodium in your diet, because a lot of people have conversations around limiting sodium, especially if there's cardiovascular problems. Well, there's a whole counter argument in that regards that sodium may actually be beneficial in that regard. So really making sure that we are looking at strategies to support pH health within the body, I think is going to be pertinent to the overall health of that individual. I think there is a really cool conversation in regards to how the body has a pH, in terms of the neural system, has a pH monitoring capability within the cerebral spinal fluid. There's actually studies that show that basically within I'm blanking, within the spinal cord itself, or the cerebral spinal fluid, there's nerve cells that can actually sense and are they're taking in neural inputs from the body in terms of pH, and then they're sending those signals to the brain to help it understand the overall environment of the body as a whole. And so as you can imagine, if you have let's say a high lactic acid buildup in the body from exercising, the brain is actually, and the body is going to sense that and send signals up into the brain that it's actually in a more stressed, less operative, efficient neural pH system. And so that is going to mobilize a whole bunch of different efforts to counterbalance that, right? Because pH is so crucial just for blood balance, right? But it goes to say that it is so critical that we're looking at whole body pH, because that ultimate stress could translate into inefficiencies within the neural network, because it's now in a constricted stress kind of fight or flight scenario in that regard. So it doesn't operate in terms of a fluid dynamic neuroplastic system. Dr. P?
Yeah, I'm glad you said whole body. I would hate to try to measure the pH in the brain. I was trying to figure out how to stick one of those strips up my nose or something.
Yeah, we could not make that.
Are we talking salivary pH, urinary pH? We've still got the test strips. Where would they check?
Well, I think, starting at least somewhere, looking at the pH of the body in terms of urine pH is a good start, right? Blood pH is pretty tightly monitored. There shouldn't be too much fluctuation, that there's more big downstream consequences if that falls out of range. But we are trying to assess neuromuscular tissue kind of pH. But, the easiest route, you mentioned it there, would probably be urine pH, and just making sure that is trending towards more of a neutral urine pH, especially at that first morning's urine, because that's going to kind of give you a more concrete assessment of whether.
Yeah, and we still have the pH tape, and it's still pretty easy to use. Green is good, yellow is caution, and once it turns that bright, I don't even know what color to call that. Yeah, you're way out of range. It's fairly easy to interpret, and that one is pretty cheap too.
Yeah.
So that's an easy way to monitor it. Good. Okay.
Easier than those blood tests and even some of these biohacking tools and continuous blood glucose monitors, right?
Exactly.
Just a urinary pH strip. So keep in mind in that regard. So kind of the final opportunity in regards to the diet optimizations would be the micronutrient, the multiverse of micronutrients for the mind, in terms of really what you should be looking at from a micronutrient perspective. In terms of vitamin complexes, really looking at vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, really trying to have a powerful antioxidant load to support healthy levels of inflammation in the brain and the body. When you have high levels of inflammation, we could kind of the analogy would be that you are looking at potential ways of vasoconstrictive, so you're not actually increasing blood flow to the brain. Also looking at immune regulation, right? So if you have an overactive immune system, that ultimately could cause processes or stress in the brain in terms of actually clearance, right? When we look at like sirtuins and we look at different longevity factors, when you have over immune system activity, you may not be able to actually have that appropriate clearance within the brain as well. There may be some signaling pathways and deficits in that regard. So vitamin C, D, and E, I think, making sure that you're evaluating that for the client may be pertinent. B complexes, this really goes into the methylation patterning of the epigenetics of the body as a whole, right? When we look at nutritive kind of strategies, we want to make sure that we have appropriate methylation patterns, because that ultimately preserves the identity of that cell or that nerve cell to make sure that it is functioning optimally, right? And so when we do supplemental strategies, or we look at circulating factors in terms of folate, B12 or B6, we want to make sure that those are healthy, because that is going to ultimately act as an insurance policy at some level to ensure that we have the appropriate methylation, which does go into ultimate downstream consequences of those sirtuins, regulation of those sirtuins, those chaperone proteins in terms of how those proteins are folding within the brain, just genetic or the identity of those cells. And so we want to preserve that with those B vitamins complexes as much as we can. Anthocyanins, I think this is a key point in regards to flavonoids and bioflavonoids that really help to promote whether they're actually acting as these xenohermetic molecules, right, that are actually stimulating sirtuins as a way. And for those that don't know, sirtuins are actually kind of clearance models that are clearance proteins that work in the brain. So whether they stimulate these xenohermetic molecules that mimic fasting in a way, or they actually support epigenetic factors for inflammation or immune regulation, right? We're really looking at complexes like anthocyanins and other flavonoids that can be found in cacao, green tea, ginkgo, and citrus fruits, and dark chocolates as well, and polyphenolic compounds that goes along with flavonoids that really help to stimulate those processes in that regard. And then last but not least would be curcumin, found in turmeric. That would be essentially trying to help support the liver and, of course, detoxification pathways, but also helping to modulate or modify markers of inflammation, right? And that goes back into, we want to keep a very fluid environment. And so if we have high levels of inflammation, though acute inflammation is beneficial, that chronic inflammation paradigm is actually going to limit the neuroplasticity of the brain and the neural network fluidity of the body as a whole. Dr. P?
Yeah, we're back to inflammation again. Yeah, but that looks like we should take the multivitamin, a shot of turmeric, and chase it with a glass of wine. I can see Laura handling that. We'll get her to make that program.
You heard it here.
A little bit of fish oil with it, and we're good to go.
Just blend it into your favorite blender. And,
oh, there you go, a smoothie, of course.
Greens and pink salt to your taste, and it's the brain health slurry.
Yes, folks, we will write that down.
So kind of to piggyback on that conversation there, I always like to have a conversation around herbals and botanicals that you may want to be kind of recommending to your clients and your patients. And so I have this herbs of a cognitive tune. When we talk about neuroresonance, I always like to put the analogy for music in that regard. So I mentioned turmeric, other compounds that may be beneficial, rosemary, right? So we have rosmarinic acid that actually has some epigenetic signaling possibilities to support neurocognitive health. I think it's very interesting that a herb like rosemary that is known for centuries to kind of be that herb of remembrance, there's actually some studies now that actually showcase how that rosmarinic acid component actually helps to support markers of inflammation. It supports vasodilative properties, working potentially within neuronal pathways and promoting neurogenesis, right? Creating that environment where new nerve growth can occur. Ginkgo would be another one. We don't carry ginkgo here at Premier, but that's another looking at the bioflavonoids in terms of how we're enriching that environment for overall neuronal health. Bokoba is mentioned a lot of times as well. And then we have ginseng and lemon balm, which you can find in our line. Lemon balm, especially within our triquinol, looking to really damper those markers of inflammation and trying to create more of a parasympathetic environment. We as a society tend to lean more on that sympathetic side. And so as you throw in herbals and botanicals that kind of push the body to more of that rest or restful state, essentially we're helping to unlock that neural fluidity. Dr. P, any thoughts?
Oh, tons of them, but those are pretty good herbs. And we're just getting to the point where we're talking about some of the other things we can do as far as, approaching brain health.
Most definitely, yeah. So, I think this is a good summary in terms of the biodynamic pool of neural inputs that you're looking at, whole body nutrient status, really looking at omega-3, trying to encourage that homeostasis, that is homeostatic states that are very stress favorable, right? So if you do get a stressor thrown in your way, you're able to adapt very quickly. We also want to keep in mind that we're kind of really supporting that epigenetic regulation. So appropriate gene regulation is going to be very, very critical for your overall brain health paradigms. And that goes into where we need to be very cognitive of the genetic variances and expressions that may occur within that individual. And so, taking that genetic history, understanding where those snippets or SNPs may occur in terms of those polymorphisms, right? And how we can encourage supplement strategies around that. Though we don't want to kind of reserve our fate to our genetics, we do want to be familiar with our familial history in terms of what we may be most at risk of. And so, especially if Alzheimer's, dementia, cognitive decline kind of runs in a family, there may be that genetic variance that you may have to bolster with different dietary and lifestyle augmentations to really support longevity within the brain as a whole. Because really what we're looking at is the decrease of the ability of the brain to form new neural connections, right? We're also looking at an attrition of those neural connections that have been made over the lifespan due to misfolded proteins, kind of waste materials, right? You get knots in terms of those neural networks. And so we want to encourage that the brain is very adaptive in unwinding those or forming new neural connections, even if there has been some sort of cognitive decline event that has occurred. I'm very confident actually, if we support really biodynamic strategies in terms of neuronal health, even somebody that has had cognitive decline ultimately could recover depending on the severity of that state, right? Because the brain is a very adaptive neural network, right? And so though one learned pattern may be kind of axed in a sense because there's been degradation, neuroinflammation as an example, we're able to actually form a new neural pathway or a new neural connection that ultimately, though that damage has occurred, we're able to kind of combat that as a whole. Kind of taking a step back from nutrients, I think this is where we get into a conversation around kind of the overall emotional constitution of the individual. I think being very aware of terms of the emotional body and trying to work within the different frequencies that may be embedded of that emotional being may be very complementary to unwinding the knots that may be occurring within the neural network. And this is where, you can kind of take analogies in terms of emotional constitutions. They can be embedded frequencies that ultimately land in certain organ gland systems. But if we're really taking the disposition of the brain, right, it's that very learned neural patterning in terms of a emotional response. And so when we look at, when somebody is going through kind of that emotional release therapy, they're working with maybe a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist to unwind that and work through that trauma, right? Being in a very nourished or nutrient rich state that allows for, I guess, new neural connections to form, right? Ultimately is going to translate into better long-term success with that clientele. And this is where you get into studies regarding how patients with depression or anxiety, when they're doing omega-3 supplementation or they're doing other lifestyle augmentations, they actually find better results with the therapy that they're doing. And so that is, kind of the theory would be that ultimately we've created an environment where they can form those new neural connections more readily. And so ultimately the other therapies or other lifestyle alterations that they're doing for that emotional constitution are more effective. And so I think that's a very rich conversation to have with your clientele. I know for a lot of practitioners that first come to Premier and they say, wait, you talk about emotions, but you're a nutrition company. It really is something that we think is pertinent to be very aware of as you work with that client and why you're making recommendations in terms of nutritional strategies. And kind of the second end of the coin in that regards to emotional constitutions would be exogenous emotional resonance, which would be kind of looking at the network of people that the individual is connected with, right? In terms of the innate resonant frequencies of the individuals around them. We as humans, from either a subconscious or a very conscious level, are picking up on those, right? And so just like if you walk into the room and you can feel that somebody's disgruntled, right? Your own neural network is going to pick up on the symphony of different neural inputs of the other individuals that they're putting off into the space. And so having that ability to be very open and adaptive, but also having a very firm grounding disposition as an individual is going to ultimately serve more, I guess, anti-fragility in terms of your innate emotional constitution. Other points that we want to kind of be aware of is the bioenergetic fields, right? In terms of other beings, right? Other individuals, living organisms, innate objects, right? Those frequencies of those objects may ultimately impact the fluidity of the nervous system as a whole. And so if we as practitioners can really kind of have that quantum thought in terms of how we're approaching, you know, whether we're consulting in terms of their setup of their home, we're looking at, you know, positioning of the beds, we're looking at the kind of the neural network, or not the neural, but the bioenergetic fields of the environment around them. That's ultimately going to be more complementary, right? We're really being more integrative into our strategies as practitioners, right? We don't want to be just singular in terms of the nutrition. We want to be, in terms of a holistic paradigm, really take that into account in terms of the innate and the non-innate from a bioenergetic field paradigm. And last but not least would be electro or environmental EMFs. And so that would be more device oriented, is kind of how, compared to bioenergetic fields, we live in kind of a synthetic world with a lot of different EMF frequencies. And so those can impair the neural fluidity, right? They can impair the communication with neurons. They can impair or kind of aggravate different field lines within the individual and impair that overall transmission of signaling capacity within the body. So if we're able to, you know, really take that into account and, you know, say, hey, these are some strategies that may help to complement or deal with the high EMFs that you're dealing with as an individual, you're ultimately being more effective in terms of your neuroconsultative strategies as a whole. So that was a mouthful, but Dr. P, you got any thoughts in that regards, or that resonate with you?
Yeah, I thought we were just going with like ERT or something, or maybe the Vastu type stuff. But yeah, you covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah, and so, you know, there's different strategies. We at Premier, we recommend, you know, EMF remediation, VOS2 remediation, right? That's the home and the office, making sure that that is more of a bio, I guess, friendly, you know, environment for the brain and the body as a whole. So if you're looking to learn more, definitely feel free to engage us on that level with your account executives in that sense. And then kind of going into neurological and lifestyle augmentation. So this is kind of our final segment in regards to longevity and really encourage a biodynamic brain. Kind of the three areas that I really think everybody should be hitting on if they're looking for those robust strategies for neurological health is to, you know, have that daily practice in terms of mindfulness strategies, looking to find homeostasis in regards to hormetic strategies, right? So being able to ground yourself into, I guess, an ice bath, for example, would be that principle of finding homeostasis in a hormetic kind of environment. But also that could be dietary and lifestyle augmentations, right? But being able to find peace essentially within a stressful situation is really the analogy, or what I'm trying to relay in that regard. And then really seek neuroplastic stimulation. Don't be static in terms of your inputs from your environment, right? Seek out new things, try new things, be able to take risks, right? Those different stimuli are going to enable and form new neural connections. And though you as a practitioner may be like, well, yeah, why should I, you know, learn a new instrument when I need to be up on top of the most cutting edge strategy in regards to detoxification or to gut health? Well, the thing is we most definitely want to be, as practitioners, very mindful in terms of our knowledge and on our relevant health subjects, but being able to stimulate the brain and the body and the mind through different avenues, right, actually may allow you to be more effective in terms of those consultative strategies with your clients. And that's because you're able to see beyond the ingrained neural patterns that you've learned from that learning session that you had, or that new technique that you learned, right? So you're actually to apply that and have a level of intuition because you've cultivated that neuroplasticity. So it's kind of that thought that you do try new things, do other things, because you're ultimately going to be able to see more in terms of your client's health and make more pertinent recommendations in that regard. And so, a lot of times with these lifestyle augmentations, we really want to be pertinent to levels of hormesis. And really, if you're not familiar with hormesis, that is essentially the adaptive response of cells and organisms to a moderate, usually intermittent form of stress. And so a lot of times when we look at hormetic strategies, like intermittent fasting, time restricted eating, XY, cold therapy, hot therapy, these lifestyle augmentations, xenohormetic molecules that you would find in plants, they ultimately help to stimulate or regulate those longevity pathways, because when the body is in a state of stress, there's an upregulation of longevity factors because the body thinks it's in a starvation mode, right? And so, or kind of a stress mode, so it needs to promote life, right? Essentially, the analogy is the body is going to seek out to promote the overall health of the organism to where it can find that land of plenty. And then once it gets to that land of plenty, it ultimately is going to accelerate aging factors, because from an evolutionary disposition, we're no longer, essentially we're no longer needing to survive. We found home and we're able to, quote unquote, mate and pass away, because our, genetically we can get past our genetic information can get passed to the next generation. And so factors of hormesis really stimulate kind of innate, almost ancestral pathways that help to really cultivate a level of health in the long term, right? And that's really where we get into these societal kind of disposition that we live in the land of plenty, right? We don't live in the land of stress. And so how we as individuals cultivating healthy stress in our environment to ultimately support long-term health in that regard. So kind of going back to the mindfulness cultivation, meditation, I think is a topic of conversation, and is very, in terms of the neurohacking space, it's very, very prevalently these days. So being able to consult or at least make recommendations around meditative strategies. Keep in mind that if we do have a very well-nourished individual, and an individual that's able to more effectively ground into meditation, just like from that choline recommendation in terms of those grounding centers of the brain, that meditation session may be more beneficial. There's a lot of different meditation strategies. You have sensory integration, you have ergotherapy, you have art therapy, relaxation, movement therapy. Really looking just to have the ability to maintain a level of intention or awareness on something that maybe not necessarily logical in thought, very exploratory, or just very, I guess, aware in terms of that nature. And so there's a lot of good studies in regards to how that meditation practice ultimately helps to alter structural features in the brain that include the prefrontal cortex, inferior cortex, really centers associated with attention and sensory integration with the body as a whole. And when we talk about being more effective as a practitioner, right, we want to make sure that we're able to have that level of awareness so that then we can make the more appropriate recommendations. Same goes for any job or, kind of activity that client may be a part of. So really trying to enforce the effectiveness of those areas. Dr. P, any thoughts there?
Oh, that was an interesting noise. No, you said it absolutely right. Starvation mode is the key.
Got it. Well, speaking of starvation, I know this is your brain, the bread and butter in terms of your slides. So I know I've been talking for a while, but I'd love you to kind of go into the benefits of intermittent fasting for our audience here in that regard.
Well, yeah. Will was putting this together, and he was wondering what ideas we could come up with, and this one popped up. I had read an article about it before, and have used it personally. It's certainly an effective weight management strategy. It's also an effective jumpstart to the metabolism. If you are actually looking even weirdly enough to build the body, there are times when reducing caloric intake is a method that promotes that. And it all boils down to what we were talking about, I don't know, half a dozen times here, inflammation. This helps reduce the stress on the body, reduces inflammation, and actually allows you to, catch your breath, so to speak, the cleanup systems to mop things up in the kidneys and the liver to, flush all that garbage out of there. So at the very least, you end up feeling better. But as it turns out, gee, what a surprise. It affects everything in a beneficial way. In the brain, it actually promotes more cells. It's like Will said, we're trying to survive. We need our brains to do that. It boosts the chemicals in the brain that cause that cell growth. It actually burns fats, ketones, instead of sugar, because now we've limited the sugar intake. So that's where the weight loss comes in. We're actually burning our belly to feed our brain. So that works out real nicely. Human growth hormone, we're not only repairing damage that's caused by the inflammation throughout the body, but a lot of that, of course, is in the brain. In fact, I'd argue that a huge chunk of that inflammation ends up in the brain. But that's a whole different webinar. It also, as part of that cleanup process and part of that regenerative process, boosts mitochondrial production. And of course, the mitochondria are the powerhouses of not only every cell in the body, but especially the brain. So I don't want to say you think better, but it feels like you think clearer. Let's put it that way. And of course, we're not the only ones who talk about this. This is actually something that is a very hot topic right now. Of course, it started out as weight loss. That's what they were investigating. And it turns out that when they looked into it, they found out that it really does have an anti-inflammatory effect. And that affects the immune system, that affects the brain, that affects digestion, that affects the liver. It takes a load off the body. And as Will said, we operate in a very loaded society. We're loaded with EMFs, we're loaded with fats, we're loaded with no exercise, we're loaded with stress. So anything you can do that might point them in a slightly different direction, I won't even say help, but anything you can do that might give them a hint that there is something else out there is going to do them a great service, honestly. And of course, obviously, Will already mentioned it a few times. This is what we call a form of stress. It's a mild form of stress. We're trying to trick the body into thinking it's starving, just by skipping a meal. And that's how fat and lazy we have become. Skip one meal and your body goes into starvation mode, you know? Honestly, look at your ancestors. How many meals did they skip in the old, Conestoga wagons headed out west and everything, If they didn't kill something on the road, they didn't eat. So we have definitely got plenty of room, to work this. So intermittent fasting, we're not talking about every day, but, a few times a week, not a problem, most of your patients, if you can get them to do it once a month, you're doing pretty good. But still, it's not really an out of the box recommendation, but most people have never thought about that. If you want to keep it simple, it's real simple. Eat food, mainly plant-based, and not a lot of it. And that is the end of the conversation. But that's a hard sell, So you try to give them, okay, here's some supplements we can do. Or like Will said, you can meditate, you can touch on the emotional component. We can do mud packs on some of the energetic components. We can, mediate the feels around their houses and stuff. So there's a million ways to approach this. Even just getting them outside and standing barefoot in their backyard, and getting some sun. How many of your patients don't even do that sort of thing anymore? So we've lost a lot of connections, and it's super easy for you to be the one that tells them, hey, remember this? So be the hero in some of these people's lives. Just remind them of some of this simple stuff. It's not rocket science. It's actually used to be common knowledge.
I think that's, I think in terms of a neural health strategy and kind of a cognitive hacking strategy for the overall neural network, it's how do we promote these different states within the body, right? We don't want to be static, right? We don't want to be,
Exactly.
we don't want to be locked into a parameter where we are in a land of plenty or a feasting environment. We want a level of feast and famine, right? And so I think it's so fascinating in terms of when we look at the neurological benefits of intermittent fasting. A lot of times what happens is, especially to highlight brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that is a key protein that actually does decline as you age, right? And so what brain-derived neurotrophic factor is actually known for is promoting a level of healthy neurogenesis within the brain. And so what's interesting, and I think it just makes logical sense, right? When you look at our evolutionary history as hunter-gatherers and kind of where we distilled from the woods, right? Essentially, we had these times of famine, and so through those times of famine, we had to be very adaptive in terms of our strategies to seek out food. And so, with that kind of status or that environment, the brain had to be more neuroplastic, right? The brain had to be able to form more neural connections more easily. And so, when you have a level of famine that you're encouraging within the brain, you're actually creating a level of ability or proficiency for the brain to actually seek out new connections. And so if we're trying to be very dynamic, quantum in thought kind of practitioners or with clients, right, we want to be able to foster that level of fluidity for forming those neural connections. And so it's just fascinating to me because it makes logical sense. Somebody that is in a famine mode, they need to be able to think on their feet more quickly. They need to be able to make a new neural connection faster, because that ultimately may mean that they survive and they thrive, or essentially they aren't able to survive and they aren't able to thrive. So, we are kind of biohacking in terms of our neurological strategies with a time-restricted eating window. Now, keep in mind, when you are implementing this with your client, or you are working, or you're saying, hey, you're wanting to try this, it can be very hard. It actually is a form of stress. So, I would encourage incremental kind of strategies when we look at intermittent fasting. It may not fit everybody, right? And so this is where we can encourage levels of fasting from a kind of circulating physiology in terms of nutrients, right? So you can actually be in a glucose depleted state and still be partially fed. And those are strategies where you're trying to not break the fast in terms of the actually circulating levels of glucose. Because a lot of times when the body is looking at feast or famine, it kind of is from a circulating glucose perspective. So if we're able to maintain levels of glucose in terms of a fasting range, you actually can do supplemental strategies, encourage kind of a well-nourished state, but the levels of glucose are not dramatically fluctuating. We can, of course, then biohack in terms of proficiency with the neural system to very tactfully increase those levels of glucose, especially like if you're trying to encourage a level of resting. And this is where, I'd like to really encourage fasting. If you are looking at fasting strategies, we may have still supplemental strategies in the morning, but you are kind of going through the day in a more fasted state. And then we are breaking that with a meal accordingly, but really trying to time our carbohydrate density to a later portion of the day. And a lot of people are like, wait, carbs make you fat, and why would you take that later in the day? Well, that's a misnomer. It's overall caloric density, right? But with that level of carbohydrate may actually encourage a level of deeper rest, and you're having that carbohydrate load later in the day. And so you're ultimately creating a level of parasympathetic kind of intensity that ultimately fosters deeper sleep. And so, there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of dive around fasting strategies. There's a lot of different supplements and products that can encourage more effective fasting strategies. So that could be a whole webinar in itself, but I think, if you're wanting to learn more, give us a call. We can definitely kind of dive that into, because I know it's a very hot topic with consumers and clients, and they want to learn more. I just think it's fascinating in terms of how that knowledge and those neural connections, it just makes sense, right? It's so cool how we weren't aware of it before originally. We had to do the studies and the science, and then of course the details come out and we're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. So last but not least is that neuroplastic simulation. So we have that mindfulness kind of awareness, cultivating that as a day-to-day practice. I really encourage that neuroplastic environment as a whole. And so that traveling, that exercise, marveling in music, right? Language learning, gaming, whatever your fancy may be, really encouraging that level of making new neural connections and seeing the world in different lights. I can't tell you how many times I've kind of gone on a whim in terms of an interest, and then it translates into better success and better consultative strategies with practitioners like yourself. And so really encouraging that with your clients, encouraging that in your own day-to-day practice. I think it's that level of, you don't know how much you can learn from something that is outside your wheelhouse, right? And how much you can translate that into the mastery of your craft. And, I think especially on the exercise paradigm, that's a level of blood flow stimulation, oxygenation, right? A lot of times when we are endeavoring and we're doing endeavors into learning strategies, learning new things, there actually is a vast increase in blood flow to the brain, because it knows that it needs to actually form those new neural connections. And so just seeking out those neuroplastic stimulations ultimately is going to translate into long-term health in the long run. So with that being said, that kind of is the conclusion of our foray into the philosophical different aspects of the biodynamic brain. We are going to be opening this up to questions and answers here. So if you haven't posted anything already, please feel free to post that below. I think I'll be diving in here shortly. I haven't even paid attention to that chat. But yep. If you are, oops, let me see if I can get back here. There, I want the presentation. So just as
Brian wants to know if you have tried cognotropic alongside exercise.
I most definitely have. Yeah, it's one of my great. I'm big on health and fitness, in case y'all didn't know that. And so, in terms of neurohacking for cognitive performance, cognotropic is great to be timed, especially during an event or around an event, because with the different flavonoids and compounds within cognotropic, you actually can increase circulation and really prime the brain for performance. There are long-term, benefits of supplemental strategies with that as a whole, but kind of with a neurocognitive hack, what a lot of patients and practitioners and what we here at Premier Research Labs like to do is actually just chew on those capsules, and you have it's a different level of stimulation. When you have those herbals and those botanicals, you're sensing that almost immediately with the capsule being broken. Of course, swig that down and make sure you actually ingest that. But I like to actually, especially before like a lecture or a presentation or, just a bout of exercise, essentially take a couple capsules, chew on those, get the benefits or the contents in the mouth, and then switch that down. It will wake you up. I can promise you that in that regard. Any other questions? Well, you got Dr. P and I here, y'all. And just as a summary, if you're wanting to learn more with biodynamic strategies, feel free to contact your account executive team. You have a regional team here now at Premier Research Labs. There, you can contact us at the 1-800 number. You also can see your email team and your contact at our executive team contact us page or about us page at premierresearchlabs.com. If you have just general questions and you'd like to just not really sure who your executive is, please feel free to email info@premierresearchlabs.com. And if you do want to take advantage of our special webinar promotion, which was the 4 topics at the top here, essentially which is going to be tomorrow only, please email orders@prlabs.com. That offer will be valid for only Wednesday, so tomorrow, May 25th only. So take advantage while supplies last. If you buy us out, we do have plenty of stock of those items, but definitely feel free to give us that email with the order or call us tomorrow with that webinar special. Let me see here. I just want to thank you, Tiffany, for being in joining us. It looks like Roxana, you had a question about salivary pH, and yes, you could essentially assess that in that regards. Now, keep in mind that if we are looking at individuals that are on blood thinners or any sort of prescription meds, we typically defer that to their PCP. keep in mind a lot of cognitive strategies, especially with herbals and botanicals, because of their vasodilative properties and because of the potential of them to make the body more fluid, right? There may be kind of that contraindication there. So we do want to be very aware of that. Just something that, we would lead to their primary care physician in regards to actually, recommending those products as a whole. I mean, there could be even questions with DHA in that regards. Let's see here. Oriana, mitohacking strategies, I think is a wonderful topic as well. I would love that. And actually this gets into kind of my other segue while we're in this question and answer session. If you as a practitioner are wanting to be a part of our webinar series here, if you are essentially seeing something cutting edge in practice, using a product in a certain way, kind of have a different philosophical viewpoint or strategy in terms of that you would like to share with our Premier Research Labs community, please reach out to us. We are very keen on bringing you onto these webinars. We want this to be a community event where we can pour into each other with different strategies, different conversational topics, different thoughts. We want to be very quantum in our nature here in terms of the audience and the conversations that we have. So if you are interested in being part of our webinar series in any way, you would like to be featured on one of our talks here with our network, please just reach out to us. We would love to evaluate that. And there may be some opportunities if you do partake in that regard. So please feel free to reach out to us in that regard, because we would love to connect with you in that sense. Jeff, it's great to see you here, Jeff. It sounds like I need some correspondence there, so I will shore up that and make sure we're all taken care of in that regard. Oriana, thank you so much for attending here. I'm glad that this is epic for your practice. I want to continue these types of conversations. I know it was very philosophically rich, but something that we want to continue to go for. Lynn, we will be sending out these slides for all attendees. So I'm glad that you were part of this webinar and you registered. We will be sending a replay link of this webinar and this event with the copy of these slides so you can kind of review that. I know there are some good catchphrases and coins that you can share with your practice and with your clients. So yeah, we'll definitely have that for you to reference that. Dr. Kim, we will be sharing the slides as well. And it looks like I got through all these comments. Pauline, it's a pleasure that you are an attendee. So I want to thank you all for your attendance and participation. Dr. P, any closing remarks or any words of affirmation for our audience here?
Have fun.
It's all
Have
about
fun,
right?
Yes, enjoy.
Perfect. Well, y'all have a great night. I want to thank you so much for being a part of our webinar this evening. It is an honor to host and be here with Dr. Piercy and be with you all. If you ever have questions here at Premier Research Labs, myself and our entire executive team here at Premier Research Labs are here to help you in any way we can. And we will be looking forward to another webinar event in a couple short weeks here. I do believe we'll be taking a dive into kinesiologic modalities and kind of the rationale and the thought, going into a little bit of QRA and what that may mean for your practice. Maybe that's a new term for you. So be on the lookout for that invite. We really are looking to expand our horizons and expand our content to make sure they're more most relevant to you and your practice and your clients. So I want to thank you so much for being a part of the Premier Research Labs Network. And I hope you have a truly wonderful night. We'll talk to you soon.
Good night, everybody.